Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of the Fishing Teacher, and much appreciated you guys checking today's video out and hanging out with me for a little bit. We're going to be talking about fishing secondary and main lake points today. Now, if you guys watch many of my videos, you hear me always talking about secondary and main lake point fishing because it is the #1 bass structure. There's secondary main lake points hold more bass more consistently than any other structure on a lake. So there's a lot to them. There's a lot of variables around it. What I want to try to do in the video today is help you understand the difference between the two, give you guys some tips and advice on how to fish them, and really just sort of understand when the bass use one over the other. So we're going to get into that in today's video. Also, guys, before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping tips. I just want to invite everybody to please hit that subscribe button here to the Fishing Teacher. Free and easy to do so. We also have memberships to the Fishing Teacher if you guys want to go further to support the channel. And also a big thank you to everybody that's been using all the links I put in my video descriptions here for the Fishing Teacher. If you guys are one of the people that have been using my tackle warehouse link that I put in every video description to purchase your tackle, you're really helping the channel out. So thank you very much from me and my family there. Okay guys, main lake and secondary points. First of all, let's define the difference between the two. A main lake point is just what it sounds like. It's a point that's on the main body of the water that's not off into a creek or cove arm. So these can be a wide different range of points. They can be steep, they can be flat, they can be in between, and they can also be to different degrees of the point. Because one of the things you have to understand is a point is not always just a real definite looking point, something that comes to a point. Sometimes a point can be really, really wide, and it's almost like it's so wide that it doesn't even look like a point. But any piece of structure on the main lake that comes to some type of a point, whether it's sharp or round, it is considered a point. Now, those are on the main lake. Now, a secondary point is a point that's usually smaller. It's usually a smaller point, and it's situated usually in a creek arm of the lake or a cove. So say, for example, if you are running down the lake and you peel off into a creek arm and you've got some coves in that particular creek arm, a secondary point would be the little point leading into those coves, or the same in a big cove. If you're in a cove or a bay, another little point within that cove or bay is called a secondary point. A secondary point is off of the main lake. Now, bass use these all year long. 12 months out of the year, bass will live on main lake and secondary points, although there are some different times of the year that are better than any others. That's what I sort of want to talk about in today's video. In general, this is sort of a blanket generalization, foundational piece of advice here, is when the water's cold or the water's hot, like for example, wintertime or the summertime, in general, the bass prefer the main lake points for the most part. Main lake points usually have a little bit closer proximity to deeper water. Depending upon how they're positioned, they can be in a little bit cleaner water. There can be varying degrees of the point, but I have found in my own preference that there's a lot more bass a lot of times that live on the main lake points in the summertime and the wintertime than on the secondary points. Now, that being said, there's always still bass on the secondary points in the winter and the summertime both, but you're trying to talk about the larger groups of fish. So, and that's usually when I'm after the main lake points is in the wintertime or the summertime. And vice versa in the springtime of the year, pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn. And in the fall time of the year, I seem to do a little bit better on secondary points within the creek arms and cove arms, because those bass in the spring, they're starting to move shallow, to look for spawning areas, and they set up on those points. And then in the fall time of the year, they're moving up shallower to feed. So they like those secondary points a little bit that time of the year as well. So that's the general gist of it as far as, how those points are set up. Okay, now the techniques for fishing points, they are vast and broad ranging because it totally depends on the water temperature and the water clarity. Now, most of the time what you're going to find, it's pretty basic understanding. The more dirty the water is, the shallower those fish are going to be up on the points. Say, for example, if your water visibility is, less than 2 foot in a lake, most of the time those bass are going to be shallow on that point. They're going to be less than, 10 foot of water for sure. And as the water gets even dirtier, they could be right up on the point bank itself. And if you got cleaner water, if the water is pretty clear, those fish could be out in 30, 40, 50 foot of water, and they could be suspended out on those points. Bass will suspend on main lake and secondary points anytime that water clarity is over about 3 feet to some extent. And you also will find that lakes that have a mixed species of mixed species of bass, like largemouth, spotted bass, and smallmouth, the more predominant that the mix of that species is, the more those fish will suspend. Spotted bass are notorious for suspending out over the end of deeper points. Now, the other factors that will determine that makes points good or not good is time of day and wind. One of the theories that I have in fishing that's been backed up by a lot of experience I've had is that a lot of the bass feed at night shallow on points. So after dark, those fish will move up shallow on those points, and then they'll move out a little bit deeper as the day goes on. So that's why fishing shallow on those points is really good early and late in the day. And then up in the day is usually when I move out a little bit deeper, look for those deeper fish or suspended fish. Another factor with points, secondary and main lake points, is wind is a big factor. Wind usually always makes the fishing better on a point. Most points don't have any cover other than the point itself, depending upon what type of rock structure you have or if there's any submergent timber. But when you're fishing a structure like a point that usually is pretty clean without any complex cover on it, usually the wind will really help you out with that. Thing about it, when you're fishing points, main lake and secondary points, you can pattern those points pretty easy. You can pattern if those fish are on the main lake or the secondary pretty quick. And also you can pattern those points by the slope or the angle of the point. Depending upon the time of the year, some of those bass like the steeper points, sometimes they like the flatter points. Just really depends in correlation again with that water clarity. Now, some of the top baits that I like for point fishing, again, are wide ranging, depends on water clarity and time of year. But probably one of my favorite baits for fishing a point is a shaky head. Shaky head and Ned rigs are really good point baits. You can cover a lot of water on them. Football jig is really good. A deep diving crankbait in the summer is really good. If you have wind on that point and the water temperatures are cooler, an Alabama rig or jerkbait is good. And one of my favorite ways to fish a point in warmer water, especially if you don't have much wind, is a walking topwater, like a Zara spook can be pretty good with that. But you can't ever go wrong with it. It's like, I tell you one thing about fishing points, guys, is if you went to a lake that you've never seen before, and if you just did nothing but fish points and didn't do anything else, there are very few times of the year that you're not going to catch some bass. Most of the time, you're going to catch some bass once you figure out the depth those fish are on and the techniques that they want. So it's a obvious way to fish and it's a simple way to fish, but there's also things to it that are going to determine your success. And the success that you're going to determine on fishing a point is keying in on that right technique, keying in on the right color, keying in on the right depth of that point. And once you find all those variables and put everything together, it can be pretty easy at times. But points are probably the number one type of structure on a lake that you can pattern. And what I'm talking about that is when you catch a bass on a point, really take a lot of awareness and note as far as the depth of the fish they came on, how far off the bank you were in relationship to the water depth that you're in. Look at the bank structure and look at the type of rock that's on it. Look how the point is positioned on the lake, whether it's, in the upper first part of the creek, or if it's in the mid part of the creek, or if it's in the back of the creek, or if it's on, the flat or the steep side of the main lake. Just pay close attention to that and duplicate that around the lake, because most lakes have an abundance of points. Most man-made lakes anyway. So anyway, guys, just a few tips on there. Point fishing, you can't go wrong with it. Points are sort of like riprap, in the fact that those are two of the most heavily fished pieces of structure on any lake because they're obvious. Riprap's obvious, points are obvious, they get a lot of fishing pressure, but the reason they're so good is fish are always on them. They're always going to be on them. They're always going to use those areas as feeding areas, as migration routes, as, just hanging out on it. And another thing that you have to realize is that bass, they will use a point periodically through the day. Now, let me give you guys one example here. I remember I was fishing about 10 years ago down at Table Rock Lake, and I was way out off the end of this point in about 50 or 60 feet of water, and there was some submergent timber down there. And I was fishing a drop shot about 30 foot down over about 60 foot of water on these treetops. And I was catching spotted bass, and about every third or fourth fish that I caught had some fresh crawdad pinchers sticking out of its throat. So I knew those bass, those crawdads don't live out there suspended in 30 foot of water over 60 foot of water. So I knew that bass had been up on that point that night. And that's what they do, is bass will relate to a point, then they may move out 100 yards away from that point during the day, and they may swim back in and use different type of depths, but they're always moving back and forth on those points from deep water to shallow water. That's what makes them such good pieces of bass structure. So anyway, I hope it helps out, guys. We'll talk later.